When did you finally see your partner's dark side? I was racing to the hospital after getting the call that my 8-year-old daughter Rachel had fallen from the monkey bars at school. She had a badly broken arm that needed surgery. When I arrived, my husband Mike was already there since he worked closer to the school. But instead of comforting our crying daughter, he was standing in the corner of her room on his phone, within earshot of Rachel. Yeah, I'm stuck here. Kid broke her arm. No, I can't make the client dinner. This is going to cost me the Dillingham contract. Rachel heard him, and through her tears she whimpered, Daddy's mad at me? Mike didn't even look up from his phone. The surgery will be thousands. There goes the boat I was looking at. Rachel's face crumpled completely. I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to fall. That's when Mike finally looked up, saw me, and said into the phone, Wife's here now. Maybe I can still make the dinner. He actually started gathering his jacket. Mike, she needs surgery, I said. He shrugged. You can handle it. This client's worth $500,000. Rachel reached for him with her good arm. Daddy, please stay. He barely glanced at her. Stop being dramatic, Rachel. It's just a little sore arm. Then he walked toward the exit. A nurse who'd been adjusting Rachel's IV stepped directly into his path. Sir, your daughter needs you. Mike tried to step around her. She has her mother. The nurse didn't move. I've worked here 15 years. I've never seen a father leave during their child's emergency. Mike's face reddened. This is none of your business. That's when an older doctor approached. Actually, it is. I'm Dr. Hamilton. I'll be doing Rachel's surgery. Both parents need to hear this. Her break is complex. She needs immediate surgery or she could lose function in her hand. Rachel started sobbing harder. My hand? I held her tight while Mike stood by the door looking irritated. How long will this take? He asked. Dr. Hamilton stared at him. Your daughter might lose use of her hand and you're asking how long? That's when other parents in the ER started noticing. A father holding his own injured son said loudly, Some people shouldn't have kids. A mother added, That poor little girl. Mike's phone rang. He actually answered it. Yeah, I'm trying to leave, but... Doctor. Hamilton grabbed the phone from his hand. This is Dr. Hamilton at Children's Hospital. This man's daughter needs emergency surgery. He'll call you back. He hung up and handed it back. Mike was furious. You can't do that. That was a client worth... I don't care if it was the president, Doctor. Hamilton said. Your daughter needs surgery now. A nurse was comforting Rachel, who kept apologizing. I'm sorry I cost money. I'm sorry about Daddy's boat. The entire ER heard. A mother in the next bed called out, Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. Mike tried to leave again. This time, a security guard stepped forward. Sir, we need both parents to sign surgical consent. Mike exploded. This is imprisonment. I have a business dinner. Doctor. Hamilton pulled up Rachel's x-rays on the screen. Look at this break. 8 hours to repair. Recovery will be months of physical therapy. Mike glanced at it. Months? That'll interfere with my golf trip. Rachel heard everything. I'm sorry, Daddy. That's when my sister Sarah arrived. I'd texted her. She saw Rachel's condition, heard Mike complaining about costs, and lost it. You're worried about money while Rachel's in agony? She was loud enough that everyone in the ER turned. Mike hissed. Keep your voice down. People are staring. Sarah got louder. Good. Everyone should know what kind of father you are. She turned to the room. This man is trying to leave for a business dinner while his daughter needs surgery. The ER erupted. Parents started calling out, Shame on you! What kind of father does that? That baby needs you. Mike's phone rang again. This time he walked toward the exit to answer it. But Rachel's desperate cry stopped him. Daddy, what if I die in surgery? The entire ER went silent. Mike, still facing the door, said over his shoulder, You're not going to die. Stop being dramatic. Then he kept walking. But when he reached the automatic doors, they wouldn't open. The security guard was holding the override button. Sir, you need to sign the consent forms. Mike turned back, furious, and saw the entire ER staring at him with disgust. A nurse was filming on her phone. This is going to the administrators, she said. Another parent called out, And social media. Mike went pale. You can't film me without. But then Dr. Hamilton announced loudly, We're documenting a father abandoning his child during a medical emergency. Mike rushed back, grabbed the forms, signed aggressively. There. Happy? He turned to leave again, but Rachel called out one more time. Daddy, will you at least kiss me goodbye? Mike stopped at the door. The entire ER watched. He turned around slowly, his face showing pure annoyance, and started walking back toward Rachel. He took forever getting to her bed, each step looking like it physically hurt him to move closer. When he finally reached Rachel, he bent down so fast I barely saw it happen. His lips touched her forehead for maybe half a second, the kind of kiss you'd give a stranger's kid at a party. Rachel's whole body went stiff, and her eyes filled with fresh tears as he straightened up and turned away. Not one word to her, not even a fake smile, just that cold peck, and he was already walking toward the door. Every single person in that ER watched him leave without looking back once. The automatic doors closed behind him and Rachel just stared at where he'd been standing. Dr. Hamilton squeezed my shoulder gently and told me they needed to take Rachel to surgery right now. He promised he'd take the best care of her and that his whole team was ready. I leaned over Rachel and kissed her cheek, telling her I'd be right here when she woke up. My voice cracked, but I tried to keep it together as the nurses started wheeling her bed toward the operating room. She looked so small on that big hospital bed, reaching for me with her good hand until the elevator doors closed between us. Sarah grabbed my arm and walked me to the surgical waiting room where a nurse handed me a stack of papers to fill out. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely write my name on the first form. The nurse who'd been filming Mike earlier stopped by our chairs and sat down next to me. She said she'd already sent the video to the hospital administration, and they were taking this very seriously. Sarah took the clipboard from me and started filling out the insurance information, while I just sat there staring at the clock. About an hour into the surgery, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike. He asked if I could handle everything because he was already at his dinner meeting with the client. Sarah saw the message on my screen and grabbed my phone before I could throw it across the room. She deleted the text and put my phone in her purse, telling me to focus on Rachel. 2 more hours passed with me pacing back and forth in that waiting room. A woman who'd been in the ER earlier came over with her husband and teenage daughter. She said she'd seen everything that happened and wanted me to know I wasn't alone. She handed me a piece of paper with her phone number and mentioned she'd already posted about Mike's behavior on the local parents' Facebook group. Her husband said he'd never seen anything like it in his life, a father walking out on his kid during surgery. More parents from the ER started coming by, bringing me coffee and snacks I couldn't eat. One father said he'd been so angry watching Mike that he'd almost gotten up to block the door himself. After 4 hours, Dr. Hamilton finally came through the doors still in his surgical scrubs. He said the surgery was going well, but the break was even more complex than the x-rays showed. Rachel would definitely regain full use of her hand, but the recovery would take months of physical therapy. He explained they were reconstructing some of the smaller bones and repairing tendon damage. I asked if she was in pain, and he assured me she wasn't feeling anything right now. He said they had about 4 more hours of work to do, but everything was progressing perfectly. Sarah held my hand while I cried with relief that Rachel would be okay. The waiting got harder after that, knowing she was still in surgery but not being able to do anything. I walked circles around that waiting room for hours, checking the clock every few minutes. Other families came and went, some getting good news, some getting bad. Finally, after 8 hours total, a nurse came to tell us Rachel was in recovery and doing great. They wheeled her into a private room about an hour later, still groggy from the anesthesia. The first thing she asked when she opened her eyes was whether Daddy came back. I smoothed her hair and told her he had to work, trying to keep my voice normal. She just nodded like she knew that would be the answer, and closed her eyes again. I stayed next to her bed all night, watching her sleep and checking her bandaged arm. The next morning, a woman knocked on our door and introduced herself as Susan Barrett from the hospital social services. She explained that multiple staff members and witnesses had reported concerns about Mike's behavior yesterday. She said they needed to do a family assessment to make sure Rachel was in a safe environment. I told her everything while Rachel slept, from Mike's comments about money to him trying to leave for dinner. Susan took notes and said she'd need to interview Mike as well. Around noon, Mike showed up carrying a huge teddy bear and a bouquet of flowers. He walked in like nothing had happened, setting the gifts on Rachel's bedside table with a big fake smile. When I told him about the social worker, his face went red and he pulled me into the hallway. He said this was my fault for not controlling the situation better yesterday. Before I could respond, Susan Barrett appeared and asked Mike to come with her for an interview. I could hear his voice getting louder through the closed door down the hall. He kept insisting everyone was overreacting and that he was persecuted for being a successful businessman. About 20 minutes later, Susan came out looking worried and told me she'd be scheduling a home visit for next week. Mike stormed past us without a word and left the hospital again. 3 days later, we were back at the hospital for Rachel's first physical therapy appointment with Joyce McNamara. Joyce had Rachel sit in a special chair with her arm resting on a padded table while she carefully unwrapped the bandages. Rachel's arm looked awful, still swollen and purple with surgical scars running down both sides. Joyce asked Rachel to try moving her fingers, and Rachel's face scrunched up as she tried so hard, but only her thumb twitched a tiny bit. Tears started rolling down Rachel's cheeks, and she kept saying sorry over and over. Joyce rubbed Rachel's shoulder and explained that this was totally normal after such a big surgery, and that her nerves and muscles needed time to wake up again. She showed us exercises we'd need to do 3 times a day at home, simple things like trying to make a fist or touching each finger to the thumb. Rachel cried through every single one because even trying hurt so much. Joyce wrote everything down on a chart and said we'd need to come twice a week for the next few months at least. On the drive home, Rachel kept looking at her hand and trying to move her fingers, getting more upset when they wouldn't work right. That night after I'd gotten Rachel to bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike who hadn't come home yet. He was angry because 3 of his clients had called him asking about what they'd seen online about the hospital thing. Someone had posted the video on the local business Facebook page, and now everyone was talking about it. He demanded that I make a public statement saying it was all a misunderstanding and that he was a good father who just had work obligations. I texted back no and turned off my phone. The next morning, Mike actually showed up for our first family therapy appointment with Alexander Booth, though he was 20 minutes late and walked in still on a call. Alexander was a calm older man who specialized in medical trauma, and he'd already talked to Susan Barrett about our case. He asked Mike to put his phone away so we could talk about how to help Rachel through her recovery. Mike set his phone on the table but kept glancing at it every time it lit up with a notification. Alexander asked Mike how he thought Rachel was handling everything, and Mike shrugged and said she seemed fine to him. Rachel was sitting right there and her face just crumpled. Alexander pointed out that Rachel was clearly not fine and asked Mike to look at his daughter and really see how she was doing. Mike's phone rang and he actually reached for it. Alexander said firmly that the phone needed to be off during sessions, and Mike got mad, saying he didn't need some therapist telling him what to do. He grabbed his phone and stormed out, leaving Rachel crying and asking if Daddy hated her. Alexander spent the rest of the session just comforting Rachel and helping her understand that Daddy's behavior wasn't her fault. 2 days later, I got a call from Daniela Jimenez, the counselor at Rachel's school. She wanted to discuss Rachel coming back to class and mentioned that several parents had reached out with concerns after hearing about our situation. Some had even offered to help with rides or meals. Daniela suggested we set up a special plan for Rachel, including letting her write with her left hand and having a buddy to help carry her things. She also recommended Rachel meet with her once a week to talk about her feelings. During Rachel's second week of physical therapy, things got really bad. Joyce was trying to help Rachel bend her fingers just a little bit, and Rachel suddenly started breathing really fast and shaking. She kept saying she was sorry for costing so much money and that she didn't mean to break her arm. Joyce immediately stopped the exercises and helped Rachel calm down using breathing techniques. She pulled me aside after and said she was really worried about what Rachel had been saying and that she needed to alert Alexander Booth right away. She'd never seen a kid have a panic attack about medical costs before. Later that week, Mike's business partner Nolan Powers showed up at the hospital during one of Rachel's appointments. He pulled me into the hallway and said he was really concerned about Mike's priorities lately. Their biggest client had called asking about the video from the ER and was thinking about pulling their contract. Nolan said he'd tried talking to Mike, but Mike just kept blaming everyone else for the situation. He wanted me to know he was there if we needed anything and gave me his personal cell number. The home visit from Susan Barrett came the following Monday, and it was a disaster. She arrived right on time, but Mike refused to come out of his office, saying he had an important call. Susan knocked on his door several times, but he just yelled through it that he was busy. She documented everything in her notebook, taking pictures of Rachel's therapy schedule on the fridge and the pile of medical bills on the counter. She interviewed me for over an hour about Mike's involvement in Rachel's care, and I had to admit he hadn't been to a single therapy appointment or helped with any exercises. Before she left, Susan said she'd have to escalate her report given Mike's lack of cooperation. That night, Rachel woke up screaming about her arm not working and begged me not to tell Daddy because it might make him even madder at her. She'd been having nightmares for days but hadn't said anything. I held her while she cried and promised everything would be okay, though I wasn't sure it would be. The next day, I called Alexander Booth about the nightmares, and he said Rachel really needed individual therapy sessions to process everything that was happening. 3 days later, Mike came home furious because he'd just lost the Dillingham contract. He threw his briefcase across the room and started yelling that it was all my fault for not keeping things private and letting people film at the hospital. He said I'd ruined his whole career and that we'd probably lose the house now. Rachel heard everything from her room and started crying again. Mike grabbed his things and moved into the guest room, slamming the door so hard that pictures fell off the wall. For the next 3 days, he barely looked at Rachel and wouldn't speak to either of us except to complain about money. Sarah came over when I called her crying and helped me look up family lawyers online. Mike had started threatening to cut off the money for Rachel's therapy, saying we couldn't afford it anymore since he'd lost his biggest client. The lawyer we called said Mike couldn't legally deny medical care for his child and that I should document every threat he made about money. I started keeping a notebook of everything while Rachel went back to the school 3 weeks after surgery, with her arm still in a special brace. Her teacher called me the first day because Rachel couldn't hold a pencil right and kept crying when other kids asked why her daddy wasn't at the hospital like their parents would be. The school counselor, Daniela Jimenez, set up special help for Rachel to use a computer instead of writing by hand, but told me Rachel barely talked to anyone and sat alone at lunch just staring at her cast. During her therapy session that week with Joyce McNamara at the rehab center, Rachel finally managed to squeeze a stress ball for the first time, and her whole face lit up. She grabbed my phone asking if we could call Daddy right now to tell him the good news, but Mike's phone went straight to voicemail, and Rachel's smile disappeared as she left a message he never returned. Joyce wrote notes about Rachel's emotional state affecting her physical progress and said she'd include it in her report to the hospital. 2 days later, Susan Barrett called me to discuss her final report, which recommended Mike attend mandatory family counseling and parenting classes, or face potential involvement from Child Protective Services. Mike got the letter that afternoon and threw it across the kitchen, yelling that everyone was trying to destroy his life over nothing. The hospital administration backed Susan's recommendations and sent Mike an official notice that he had to comply or they'd escalate to CPS. Mike started going to therapy sessions with Alexander Booth the next week, but Alexander called me after the third session saying Mike just sat there giving one-word answers or staying completely silent, clearly just running out the clock. Alexander documented everything, including Mike checking his phone every few minutes and refusing to engage with any questions about Rachel's emotional needs. That weekend, I found Rachel at Mike's desk with markers and her left hand trying to write something on construction paper. She'd made a card that said, "I love you, Daddy," with a drawing of them together, and left it right on his keyboard where he'd see it. The next morning, when I went to get coffee, I saw the card in the trash can under banana peels and coffee grounds. I quickly grabbed it and hid it in my dresser before Rachel could see what happened to her gift. My phone started blowing up that afternoon with messages from friends saying someone posted the ER video on TikTok with commentary about toxic parents, and it already had 200,000 views. Mike came home screaming because his company's Google reviews were flooded with one-star ratings calling him a monster and saying they'd never do business with someone who abandons their injured child. His phone rang non-stop with angry voicemails from strangers who found his number online and wanted to tell him what they thought of him. Nolan Powers showed up at our house the next evening and asked Mike to take a leave of absence until things calmed down because clients were pulling contracts. Mike agreed, but instead of using the time to help with Rachel's care, he sat in his home office all day playing video games and coming out only to tell Rachel how she ruined his whole career by falling off those monkey bars. Rachel heard every word and started apologizing constantly for everything, even for needing help cutting her food. During a really hard therapy session the following week, Joyce was working on Rachel's finger exercises when Rachel suddenly broke down sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. She kept saying she wished she never fell, because then Daddy would still love her, and maybe if her arm got all better, he'd love her again. Joyce held Rachel while I documented everything on my phone for Alexander, and Joyce said she'd never seen a child blame themselves so completely for a parent's behavior. Alexander called an emergency session 2 days later and told Mike directly that his behavior was causing serious psychological harm to Rachel and could affect her recovery. Mike rolled his eyes and said everyone was being dramatic about a kid with a broken arm, but Alexander warned him this was becoming a custody issue and courts don't look kindly on emotional abuse. Mike stood up and walked out saying he didn't have to listen to this garbage from someone who probably didn't even have kids. Sarah came over that night after Mike went to bed and helped me set up online banking for a new account in just my name at a different bank. She'd been researching financial abuse after Mike started questioning every single receipt for Rachel's care and demanding to know why therapy cost so much when Rachel wasn't even better yet. The lawyer we'd consulted said Mike's threats about cutting off money for medical care counted as financial abuse and told me to document every time he complained about costs or threatened to stop paying. I transferred enough money for Rachel's upcoming therapy sessions and medical supplies, keeping all the confirmation emails as evidence. Mike found out about the account 3 days later when he was going through bank statements and accused me of stealing from him. He said I was plotting against him with everyone else, and that Rachel's injury had turned into some conspiracy to ruin his life. Rachel heard him yelling from her room and came out asking if Daddy was mad about her arm again, and I had to carry her back to bed while she cried. 3 weeks later at the therapy clinic, Rachel was bending her fingers around a foam ball while Joyce marked notes on her clipboard. Rachel managed to squeeze the ball halfway, and Joyce wrote down 40% mobility, but Rachel didn't smile or cheer like she used to when she made progress. She just looked at me and asked if we could go home now, because Daddy wouldn't care anyway since he never asked about her exercises anymore. Joyce pulled me aside while Rachel put on her jacket and showed me the notes she'd been adding to the reports for Susan Barrett about Rachel's lack of celebration over improvements. That evening, Mike's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from clients, and I heard him in his office yelling at someone about the video going viral on more platforms now. The next morning, he came into Rachel's room while she was eating breakfast and told her she'd ruined his entire life by falling off those stupid monkey bars. His face was red and he kept pointing at her cast, saying everything was her fault, and now nobody wanted to work with him because of what she did. Rachel started crying so hard she couldn't eat, and I grabbed her backpack and took her straight to Sarah's house for the night. Sarah made Rachel hot chocolate while I called Susan Barrett to report what happened, and Susan said she'd been reviewing all the documentation from Joyce and Alexander and needed to file a formal report with Child Protective Services immediately. 2 days later, a caseworker showed up at our door with official papers ordering Mike to attend anger management classes starting the following week. Mike crumpled the papers and threw them on the kitchen counter, saying this was all part of my plan to destroy him, but the caseworker told him it wasn't optional. At parent-teacher conferences the following week, Rachel's teacher pulled out a folder of drawings Rachel had made during art time. Every single picture showed our family, but Mike was either facing away from everyone else or completely missing from the scene. The teacher said she was worried about Rachel's emotional state and had already shared the drawings with Daniela Jimenez, who was adding them to Rachel's counseling file. Daniela came into the meeting and said the drawings showed clear signs of a child processing rejection from a parent figure. The next therapy appointment, Mike actually showed up, but he spent the whole time complaining to Joyce about how much everything cost. He kept checking his phone and asking why insurance wasn't covering more, and saying Rachel should be better by now for all the money he was spending. Rachel was trying to show him how she could bend her fingers more, but he wouldn't look up from the insurance paperwork he'd brought. When Rachel started crying because her hand hurt during the exercises, Mike said she was being dramatic again, and Joyce asked him to leave the room immediately. Mike stormed out, saying this was a waste of time and money, and Joyce documented everything in her notes while I held Rachel. That weekend, I met with the lawyer Sarah had recommended, and we went through all the documentation I'd been collecting for weeks. The lawyer said I had more than enough evidence to file for legal separation with temporary custody arrangements that would protect Rachel. We filed the papers on Monday, and Mike was served at his office on Tuesday afternoon, which made him angrier than I'd ever seen him. He texted me a photo of the papers with the message that I'd declared war on him, and he'd make sure I regretted this. But I didn't care about his threats anymore, because Rachel needed protection from his anger and blame. At her next therapy session, Rachel's mobility had improved to 60%, and Joyce said the medical team was really optimistic about full recovery within a few months. Rachel looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked if Daddy would come back and love her again when her arm was all better. My heart broke into pieces hearing her still hoping Mike would change if she could just heal fast enough. 2 weeks later was Rachel's school play, where she had a small part as a flower in the spring production. Mike showed up, but I could smell alcohol on him from 3 rows away, and he kept stumbling over people's feet trying to find a seat. During the middle of the performance, he stood up to leave and tripped over an entire row of chairs, making a huge crash that stopped the whole show. The principal called security, and they removed Mike from the auditorium while all the other parents stared and whispered. The principal found me after the show and said Mike was banned from the school property without prior written approval from the administration. Rachel had seen everything from the stage and spent the ride home asking why Daddy was acting weird at her play. After 6 weeks of documentation from Joyce, Susan, Alexander, and the school, Alexander recommended supervised visitation only for Mike's time with Rachel. He submitted his recommendation to the court with pages of evidence showing Mike's lack of appropriate parental engagement and emotional harm to Rachel. The judge agreed and assigned a court-appointed supervisor who would be present for all of Mike's visits with Rachel going forward. Mike's first supervised visit was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a neutral location, and the supervisor introduced herself to both of them. Rachel had brought her therapy tools to show Mike how much progress she'd made with her exercises since he never came to appointments anymore. But Mike sat in the corner on his phone the entire hour taking work calls while Rachel tried over and over to get his attention. The supervisor wrote down every single thing in her official report, including how many times Rachel tried to engage with Mike and how many times he was ignored her. 3 days after that awful visit, Nolan Powers showed up at our house with a stack of papers and a check. He sat at our kitchen table and explained that he couldn't keep working with someone who treated his own kid like Mike did. The buyout amount was fair, but Mike had to sign within 48 hours, or Nolan would dissolve the whole company and start fresh without him. Mike came by that evening and signed the papers while muttering about how we'd poisoned his business partner against him. He grabbed the check and left without even asking about Rachel's therapy progress. The next week at Rachel's group therapy session, Joyce pulled me aside to show me her notes. Rachel had been playing with 2 other kids who had arm injuries, and for the first time in weeks she was actually laughing. Joyce wrote in her report that Rachel's mood improved significantly during sessions when Mike wasn't mentioned or expected to show up. We started celebrating every small win, like when Rachel could hold a pencil for 5 seconds, or bend her wrist 10 degrees more than the week before. Mike missed his next supervised visit, claiming a work emergency at his new job selling insurance. Then he missed the one after that because of a training conference. The third missed visit was supposedly due to car trouble, but the supervisor had already documented the pattern. My lawyer filed the paperwork, and 2 weeks later the judge reduced Mike's visitation to once a month and increased his child support by $300. Rachel's therapy was going better than anyone expected, and by week 12 she had 75% mobility back in her hand. She could write her name again and even drew a picture of a butterfly that she hung on the refrigerator. She stopped asking when Daddy would visit and started talking more about her friends from therapy group. Alexander Booth called me after Rachel's session to share his assessment. He said her anxiety scores had dropped by half since the separation, and she wasn't showing signs of the trauma responses from earlier. He recommended keeping her in individual therapy, but said she was one of the most resilient kids he'd worked with. That same week, my lawyer called to read me a letter from Mike's attorney. Mike was offering to terminate his parental rights completely if I agreed to drop all child support requirements. I told my lawyer absolutely not, because Rachel deserved that financial support whether Mike wanted to be her father or not. The lawyer filed our response and Mike's attorney never brought it up again. Sarah planned a surprise party for Rachel's therapy graduation and invited everyone who'd helped us. Dr. Hamilton showed up with a card signed by the whole surgical team. Joyce brought cupcakes decorated like little hands making thumbs-up signs. Even Susan Barrett from Social Services stopped by to congratulate Rachel on her hard work. Rachel wore her favorite purple dress and showed everyone how she could write the whole alphabet with her recovering hand. Dr. Hamilton knelt down and told Rachel he was proud of how brave she'd been through everything. The divorce papers came through on a Tuesday morning 4 months after that first hospital visit. I got full custody and Mike got supervised visitation that he'd already stopped using. When I explained to Rachel that Daddy would live somewhere else forever now, she just nodded and asked if we could get a cat since Daddy was allergic and wouldn't be around anymore. 6 months after the surgery, Rachel's hand was at 90% function, and Joyce said she didn't need therapy anymore. They had a little graduation ceremony where Joyce gave Rachel a certificate that said, Bravest Patient Award, with gold stars all around it. Rachel insisted on hanging it in her room right above her bed where she could see it every morning. Mike had moved to another state by then for some new sales job. He sent a text once asking how Rachel was doing but never called or visited. Rachel had stopped mentioning him completely and spent her time focused on the school where she was doing great. She'd joined an art class and was learning to paint with her recovered hand. Her teacher said she had real talent, and Rachel beamed when she showed me her paintings of flowers and trees. We'd survived everything Mike put us through and came out stronger on the other side. Alexander Booth brought a special notebook to Rachel's next session and helped her write a letter to herself for when she turned 18. Rachel gripped the pen carefully with her healing hand and wrote about being brave during surgery and working hard in therapy even when it hurt. She drew a picture of Dr. Hamilton at the bottom and told Alexander she wanted to be a doctor who helped kids with broken bones. Alexander photocopied the letter and put the original in an envelope for me to keep safe. 2 weeks later, my boss called me into her office and said she'd been watching how I handled everything while never missing deadlines or dropping projects. She promoted me to senior analyst with a $20,000 raise that more than covered what Mike should have been paying in support. I signed the paperwork and texted Sarah the good news, but didn't tell Rachel yet because I wanted to surprise her with something special. The school art contest happened in March, and Rachel entered a painting she'd made during occupational therapy of a butterfly landing on a hand. She used watercolors, and her teacher helped her hold the brush steady when her fingers got tired. The judges picked her painting for first place in the second grade category, and the whole family came to the ceremony, except Mike, who didn't even know about it. Rachel stood on stage holding her blue ribbon and certificate while Sarah took pictures, and Joyce cheered from the audience. She never once looked around for her dad, or mentioned that he wasn't there. Sarah brought someone to dinner the next month, a teacher named Jordan who worked at the middle school across town. Rachel immediately started showing Jordan her art projects and therapy exercises while I watched them interact. Jordan helped Rachel with her homework after dinner, and taught her a card game that made her laugh. So hard she got hiccups. Later, when Jordan went to the bathroom, Rachel whispered that Jordan was way nicer than Daddy ever was, and asked if they could come to dinner again soon. By the 1-year mark after surgery, Rachel's hand worked almost perfectly, and she could do everything her classmates could do. Her confidence had grown so much that she volunteered to read aloud in class and joined the school choir. She rarely mentioned Mike anymore except when she had to write about family for school projects, and even then she usually just wrote about me and Sarah. Dr. Hamilton saw us for a final follow-up and said her recovery was one of the best he'd seen. Rachel asked me one evening if she could call Jordan her bonus parent since Jordan came to all her choir concerts and therapy graduations. She explained that Jordan acted more like a parent than Mike ever did, bringing her favorite snacks to appointments and remembering all her friends' names. I told her she could call Jordan whatever felt right to her, and she immediately ran to tell Jordan, who got tears in their eyes and hugged Rachel tight. We ran into Mike at the grocery store during his brief visit back to town for some business thing. Rachel saw him first, and her whole body tensed up, but she politely said hello when he walked over. Mike seemed surprised when she didn't run to hug him and just stood next to my cart holding my hand. He asked about her hand, and she showed him it worked fine, then said we needed to go because Jordan was making dinner. I saw the relief on her face when we walked away, and she didn't look back once. That weekend, Rachel and I hung her therapy graduation certificate on her bedroom wall next to her art contest ribbons and photos from all our celebrations. We arranged everything just how she wanted it, with her Bravest Patient Award from Joyce in the center, surrounded by pictures of her with Sarah, Jordan, Dr. Hamilton, and me. She stood back to admire our work, then hugged me tight and said she was glad we had each other. I held her close and knew we were both finally healed and genuinely happy. This whole journey we've shared really hit me on a deeper level, and I'm honestly grateful you let me be here for it with you all. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.